I want to start by introducing myself in my language, Potawatomi. Bozo Jayak, Angela Riley, Nadejnikas, Shishibani, Potawatomi, Ndak, Miigwech, Ibiyayak, Shote, and Gomse. I said, hello, my name is Angela Riley from the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma, and I thank you all for being here. As you know, I'm the director of the American Indian Studies Center and a professor of law here at the law school. And I want to just begin by recognizing that we are on the ancestral land of the Tonga people and just take a moment to have gratitude for this land and this place. And I also want to, of course, thank, I'm sure there are many thanks this morning, but thank Kathleen and her wonderful staff for their incredible organization and hospitable nature. So I thought what I would talk about today was just to give you a sense of how all of this looks from the perspective of American Indian Studies. So we are a group that, for many reasons, mostly because we're numerically small, don't always have the biggest voice, and people don't always know that much about us and our history and why it is that we do what we do. So I thought that maybe it would be valuable to understand, at least from my perspective, why American Indian Studies is so important at UCLA. It's been completely clear since I arrived that the American Indian Studies Center is incredibly vulnerable. It was made clear to me from the time that I interviewed that if sort of one of the babies had to be killed, meaning of the ethnic studies centers, we were probably the first to go. So I knew, I've approached this position, my official appointment began in July of last year. I was acting director before that, so I've known since I came that that was the state of affairs, and that's the climate within which we've operated. So I thought that I would talk a little bit about why I think American Indian Studies is different from the ethnic studies generally, and why it is that I personally feel that there needs to be a place for American Indian Studies here. So certainly we have commonalities with the ethnic studies centers, and we work very closely with them, and we have a lot of common goals and missions. But there are some key differences about American Indian Studies that are rooted in the history of Indian nations that I think is germane to this conversation. And I wanted to bring up today and point out how particularly public research universities like UCLA, I believe, have a duty to support American Indian Studies programs that are substantively rich and culturally appropriate. One thing that isn't always clear from the outside looking in is that when you're talking about American Indians and American Indian people, where most minority groups in the history of the US, though certainly not monolithically, but largely have sought equality, integration, and non-discrimination, American Indians have almost from the time of the founding and until today have sought to be separate and to be left alone as self-governing governments and cultures and institutions. So we have a different kind of overarching goal and a very different place in the democratic structure that is America than other groups do. So I thought I would start by just talking a little bit about how this is. For many of you, this will be repeating information you already know, and for that, I apologize. For others, I have to say that in the time that I've been in the academy, I have been repeatedly surprised by many people, many like-minded people who are incredibly educated. But the story of American Indians and American Indian nations is widely unknown. And so I think it might be useful, or at least interesting, hopefully, to point out a few things that I think explain my position here. So I want to just start with a little bit of history, and that is to explain that, as many of you are aware, when Europeans first arrived here on this continent, they encountered millions of indigenous peoples who were already living in organized nations of varying degrees of sophistication with wide cultural differences and linguistic differences between them. But they encountered Indian nations, and the process of colonization then that happened on this continent happened through a process of engaging with Indian nations as nations. Particularly when the balance of power favored Indians and not whites in the early beginnings, it was much too costly to try to take the land by force. And thus began the treaty process, where treaties were entered into between the colonizing powers and Indian nations as nations to negotiate for land and peace. And the deals struck very widely, but for the most part, treaties have some common characteristics, which is typically an Indian nation would agree to cede land and reserve the right to stay in its aboriginal territory on a smaller piece of land, in exchange for peace and protection from states and from frontiersmen. So always the goal, the overarching goal, was measured separatism, and that was to be somewhat outside of the dominant polity. Just to give you an example of how this works in a concrete way, at the drafting of the US Constitution, the question of how America was going to deal with its racial problem, and namely slavery, was on the table and was widely discussed. Indians were contemplated, but completely differently and separately. Indians were not talked about in the context of how to deal with the rights of individual people who were Indian. They were talked about in the context of a larger framework of numerous independent nations that had to be dealt with as such in order for whites to proceed with the opening of the western frontier. And one point here is just that the regulation of Indian affairs in the late 1700s in terms of the federal structure fell under the War Department. So Indians were very much considered nations and self-governing governments that were outside of the dialogue of individual rights and inclusion in the way that the country proceeded in regards to other groups. Obviously, this balance of power began to shift, and in 1871, treaty making ended. But tribes continued to be dealt with as nations, and although certain aspects of sovereignty were diminished, tribes still retained sovereign rights and live in a separate state from the larger polity and retain cultural distinctiveness. So bringing us up to today, I think it's clear that the eradication of the Indian problem didn't go as colonizers thought it was going to go. The idea was that by the end of the 19th century, the Indian would cease to exist. The policy of the time was to kill the Indian and save the man. But it didn't happen. And today in the United States, there are over 550 federally recognized Indian tribes. There are over 100 in the state of California. And they assert control over their own territory and retain their own governments with the power to tax, to regulate, to incarcerate, to exclude, functioning as full, thriving governments in many respects, though certain aspects of sovereignty absolutely were diminished. Many of them were not. As some of you may know, I'm a judge for my tribe, so I'm involved in the process of disseminating justice in Indian country. So these tribes now are in a new age of increased participation in a larger governmental society, as many of you know, and aggressively pursuing economic development that's pulling many of them out of poverty for the first time since the 1800s. So how does all of this relate to what goes on at UCLA and American Indian Studies? American Indian tribes want their young people to be educated, and they want them to be educated not in the education of the past, which was an education of assimilation and humiliation, but to be educated in a way that's culturally relevant and culturally appropriate, and an education that's substantively meaningful, that can convey the complex issues surrounding sovereignty, resource protection, and cultural survival. And that's what American Indian Studies programs, research, and courses do. They help to provide that education, and they help to explain to students the complex dynamic of what it means to be a self-governing indigenous nation within the geographical boundaries of a democracy that has an immigrant history and that has traditionally aspired to eradicate difference between individuals rather than contemplate large and accept large differences of self-governing groups. So I believe this is part of the duty of a public institution and of a public institution like UCLA. And even though we understand and recognize that our numbers are small and that by virtues of the process of colonization they will likely remain small, I believe that the public university has an obligation to educate the Indians on whose land these institutions were built and who have for too long, I think, been sacrificed for other people's advancement. So ultimately, destruction of programs like American Indian Studies will only make it more difficult to recruit Native students and Native faculty to UCLA, which will then, as we've already seen, devolve into a self-fulfilling prophecy of irrelevance when the priorities have to be set between competing interest groups. And so I see part of my contribution to this conversation today, and largely to UCLA, is to help make sure that that does not happen. Chimekwe.